Thank you again for joining me. This is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. I'd like to complete what I started in the last podcast, covering some information about mental illness and Christianity. I'm getting this from the book Unanswered by Jeremiah Johnson. And I was just going to do a standalone podcast on that one chapter. That was chapter 8 that we did last time. But I'd really like to continue because this mental illness it really bothers me because we see it in the churches and people don't want to talk about it. He starts his chapter, this will be chapter 9 now from his book. He tells the story of the famous sniper, American sniper. That's Chris Kyle. He was a Navy SEAL. And when he came back from combat, 4 tours in Iraq, if you can imagine that, he had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And he suffered all sorts of nightmares of being in battle. And he finally was able to help other Marines and listen to their stories. And then what an awful thing, he was recovering, that he and a close friend were shot to death at a gun range by a former Marine who was mentally ill. And because of that, because of the success of that movie based on his life, American Sniper, people started talking more about mental illness. And he said, we need to have that conversation in church too. He said, the church is silent about mental illness and avoids the mentally ill. And he said, it's so sad that when church members are brave enough to admit that they're struggling with mental illness, they get ostracized often from the faith community. He said, we end up being a church that's a community of denial. Well, that's pretty sad. So Johnson tells the story of a woman named Anna, whom he knows, goes to his church. She spent half her life struggling with mental illness, and now she's speaking out about it. He said, she doesn't fit the typical stereotype of what you think somebody dealing with mental illness is supposed to look like. Why? Well, she came from a wonderful Christian home. Her parents and her brothers and sisters are committed followers of Jesus. They're all active in their local church. They serve their community. She's talented. She's educated. She speaks well. And Johnson said, you'd never really guess that she struggles with this. But it began when she was diagnosed as a young person with type 1 juvenile diabetes. And her health spiraled into years, he says, of anxiety and depression and an eating disorder. And she said, I didn't know I was depressed. Nobody ever talked about it. And she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't like what she saw, and she got angry at God. How could God curse me with this dysfunctioning body? She didn't want to go to church. She felt like she was such a failure as a Christian. And this is a quote from her. No one ever talked to me about my mental illness. None of my teachers, no sermons from my pastors or my youth group leaders, and my parents never talked to me about it. She says, I lost connection with all my friends. I pushed everyone away, broke up with my boyfriend, lost faith in God. I was taken away from a job I loved. Said I never got better. And she said, I got sick of living like this. But thank goodness her parents and a psychiatrist intervened and saved her life. And she said, once my brain was properly nourished, that she went to a treatment center. So she said, once my brain was properly nourished, I realized it was not my fault. My anxiety, depression, mental illness, and eating disorder did not make me a bad person or a failure as a Christian. I had a medical condition and I needed professional help. She said, I can't help but wonder if I'd learned about depression, anxiety, and mental disorders growing up, maybe I would have seen red flags sooner and asked for help. But how could I seek for a problem I didn't know? So he goes on to pass this story to say, what do you think of when you think of the term mental illness? He said, you probably think of people in a hospital gown and some kind of psych ward, but he says, would it surprise you to learn that people with mental illnesses worship at your church and attend Bible study class with you? He said, that tells you there's just not much that's going on in the church regarding mental illness. He said, we act like it doesn't exist. And then he's got some real wake-up calls here. It's a National Institute of Mental Health had a bunch of data that he uses at this point in his chapter. Depression is the leading cause of disability in the world. Let me say that one more time. Depression. That's the leading cause of disability in the world. Then he says, in 2012, now I realize that's a little older, but there were something like 44 million adults over age 18 with a mental illness in the past year. 1 in 5 adult Americans suffers from a mental illness. 1 in 5. So think about your workplace. Think about your neighbors. Think about extended family. More than 20% of children, either now or maybe some point during their lives, have had a serious, debilitating mental disorder. 1 in 20 Americans lives with something really serious: bipolar, schizophrenia, PTSD, or chronic depression. In 2012, something like 16 million adults 18 and older, just in the U.S., had at least one major depressive episode in the past year. So I'm giving you a lot of numbers here, and I don't want it to overwhelm you or cause you to kind of nod off. But, I mean, those are amazing statistics, aren't they? Kind of sad. 48%, almost half the world's population, is going to have an experience with mental illness sometime during their life. Wow. And he said, well, the number one problem in our churches regarding this mental health issue is, he said, the number one problem is silence. Something like 1 in 4 people suffer from mental illness, so that can isolate people, cause them to be less productive members of society, and actually shorten their lifespan. It's not a choice. It's treatable. No one is unaffected by mental illness, he says. He says we as Christians should be aware of the problem. We should remove that stigma because it's out there. It's all over the place. And something like only 20 to 40% of the people who have mental illnesses are productively employed, mostly due to shame and stigma. And so he said, nobody's talking about it in the church. He says, we've got to stop the shame and exclusion. He said he studied the life of Jesus. He's a Bible scholar. He says, I never see Jesus banishing a hurting person in his ministry. Mental illness, he says, is isolating. People who have this, they feel cut off from the church. They feel abandoned by God. So people don't just get fixed at the altar by a passionate prayer or anointing oil. Does God heal? Sure. Does he work miracles? Oh, yeah. But there are people who continue to struggle with mental and emotional problems. We've got to avoid shaming them, he says. He says we need to understand mental illness. He says Peter Jennings, who was a former ABC News anchor, was known for always showing up. He said the secret to life is showing up. The church needs to show up, Johnson says, regarding mental illness. He said it's so neat about the church. It's a place of community. We all believe together there. We grow together. We hurt together. And we suffer together. So when mental illness hits somebody in the church, that's happening to the entire body of Christ in a sense, isn't it? If somebody struggles, in a sense, we're all struggling. So he said we have to start by defining mental illness. He said a lot of people don't even know what it is. So he defines it as a physical dysfunction of the brain, and that causes the inability to think or feel or act in a normal manner. Okay, so I thought that was a good way to put it. He says the church should be an essential player in treating mental illness. He said the church shouldn't give up on these people. We shouldn't be casting them aside. We shouldn't push out the mentally ill. We need to take responsibility. We should be ministering to people. So he says, let's go to what he calls the healing equation. What are things that we should be doing? What would that look like to be helping people? Well, here we go. First, admit that every family struggles. You know, I can vouch for that. When we all go to church, we all look at each other. How are you doing? Oh, fine. How's the family? Great. But honestly, if we could sit down with somebody and say, no, tell me really, then the stories start coming out. So we admit that every family struggles. We're all broken. Yes, that's the definition of the human race, isn't it? We're all messed up. We've got to reach out to one another and begin an honest conversation. We've got to think differently, he says, as the church. How do we deal with this together rather than looking at the people who are struggling like they're the problem? So, number one, admit that every family struggles. Number two, love instead of judge, condemn, and misunderstand. And he said, One of the funny observations I made very early in his ministry is that Christians don't gossip, they share prayer requests. Yeah, that's a joke, but it's funny because there's some truth in it. He says one of the reasons we don't discuss mental problems in the church is we're worried that people are going to gossip and they're going to ostracize us. He said we've lost our first love. Think about John 13:35. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So loving instead of judging and condemning and misunderstanding. Number 3, build support groups for every age level in the church that addresses mental disorders. So mental illness doesn't separate people from the love of God. It shouldn't separate us from the love of our church either. It said, you've got this idea out there somehow that children are not affected by mental illness. Oh, no. He said mental illness among every age group is increasing. We've got to educate ourselves. Some of the most successful Christians that he knows engage in Christian counseling or therapy. So he talked to that woman that I mentioned earlier in this podcast who had her mental illness issues and finally resolved them. When he talked to her, he said, what helped you the most? And she said, for recovery, she said it was being surrounded by positive, supportive people who discuss mental illness instead of just ignoring it. Experiencing community, back to that word again, that's a major part of the treatment process. Let me stop there for just a second. That word community is so important. I look around today and I think about my life and people I know and our society. We're all turning into like individual atoms. We're all kind of flying away from each other. You know, we used to have these community things. You had Elks Club and you had Kiwanis and Rotary, and I think they're still around, but we're not as community-oriented as we used to be, and I think people hurt when they're not part of a community, when we're just isolated, and we're supposed to make our way on our own, which that puts a lot of pressure on you. And yet Christianity is so great because we are a community. I remember one time my wife and I were up at Bodie, which is a ghost town that's now guarded by the state of California. And you can walk through the town there. It was prominent in the late 1800s. And there's a church there. And it just struck me that 100 and some years ago, 150, let's say, I could have gone to that church and stepped inside, and I would have had brothers and sisters in the faith. They would have greeted me. We would have shared songs. We would have shared prayer. We would have shared Bible verses. We have a community. You know, Christianity is the largest multi-ethnic community in the world. Isn't that neat to think about? We have brothers and sisters all over the world. And so when he mentions the value of support groups and community, I say amen to that. All right, here's his fourth point. Encourage the mentally ill to serve within our church communities. It said many of them are witty and good-humored and highly intelligent. And he said it's an overlooked fact that some of the greatest Christians of all time have had lifetime struggles with depression, with thoughts of suicide, with mental illness. So let me go through those 4 one more time. He calls it the healing equation. What are some of the things that we could do? Admit that every family struggles. Love instead of judge, condemn, and misunderstand. Build support groups for every age level in our church that address mental disorders. And then finally, encourage the mentally ill to serve within the church community. Now, he tells some stories at the end of this, and I think this is worth telling you. I love stories. I hope you do too. He says when he and his wife were in Oxford, England, they were living there, and they traveled to a little town known as Olney, O-L-N-E-Y. He said, maybe you've heard of it. That was where John Newton, back in 1773, wrote what's probably the most famous hymn of all time. I bet you know it, Amazing Grace. It was published a few years later in a book called The Olney Hymns, but not too many people are aware that that hymn book actually had a co-author who was a friend of John Newton, in fact, a very close friend. His name is William Cowper. He wrote 70 or so of those 300 hymns that are in that. He said maybe you recognize some hymns like, There's a Fountain Filled with Blood, Oh, for a Closer Walk with God. So Cowper was one of the great poets of the 18th century. By the way, he spells it C-O-W-P-E-R. So Cowper was one of the great poets of the 18th century. Benjamin Franklin loved Cowper's poems. There's a window in the great Westminster Abbey that honors him. Well, here's the interesting part about him. This man struggled with paralyzing depression his whole life. He tried suicide more than once. His depression was chronic. And before he met John Newton, he spent years in an insane asylum. But he showed up at that church, and John Newton took him on as a friend, and he wrote beautiful poetry, and yet he dealt with this awful illness for a long, long time. So at the end of the chapter, what Johnson is saying, mental illness touches us all, whether we're great poets or just ordinary people going through life. He said John Newton rescued Cooper. He rescued the friend by just being there and supporting him. He loved him, even with his mental illness, put him to work, writing hymns. So at the very end of the chapter, Johnson said, where do you find yourself in this story? Maybe you're a John Newton, and you have a friend or a family member that you need to walk with. He said, our church is filled with William Coopers, talented people. They're struggling with mental illness. He said, let's commit to God that invisible diseases should not be invisible any longer. So he said, rather than asking a family struggling with mental illness to leave our church, let's integrate them into our communities of faith. So I thought that was such a nice, positive way to end this chapter. As tough as it is to think about mental illness, but there are things we can do just to simply be there for people and be a community. I want to come back to that more than once. Being a community is so important. All right, well, then that gives you kind of a feel, at least for this book called Unanswered. Now, I'm not sure would you call it apologetics? I don't know. Some of the chapters definitely are arguing, for example, for the resurrection of Jesus. But I thought this was so sensitive and so important that I liked talking about it and covering this today. So the book is called Unanswered. Jeremiah Johnston is the author, and he deals with these sensitive issues. So I hope this will be of benefit. I hope you can reach out to others. And maybe your church already has something, but maybe you can encourage the pastor or the elder board or somebody to sit down and begin putting together some kind of program or some way to reach out to anybody in the congregation that may be dealing with a mental illness. Well, thank you again for being part of this, and I hope you're having a good day, and we'll do another podcast soon.